This is the second of two videos on research methods for historians. The first went over organizing secondary sources, along with some general best practices. This one is longer, and goes into both digitizing and organizing archival research material, as well as note-taking. You needn't have watched the first video to understand the second. I'll touch on a couple of important points from the first video as I go through this. 4 comments as we begin. The first 2 I mentioned in the first video. 1, I use a Mac. There are PC equivalents for probably everything that I go over here. Second, these are simple strategies that don't require any real knowledge of programming. If you're interested in getting more under the hood or looking for ways to automate tasks more than I do here, check out the Prof Hacker or Grad Hacker blogs. Third, you'll note that I build a lot of redundancies into my practices here. That is to say, I tag information, I index documents from the archives in a couple of different ways to try to make sure that I'm always able to find them later on. Finally, you'll note that I use programs such as Excel here rather than a cloud-based service like Google Sheets. When I first started to develop these systems and practices for myself more than 10 years ago, the archives I was using in Colombia didn't yet have Wi-Fi. While I increasingly use Google Sheets or Docs back in the States, I haven't made a complete transition for archival work because I don't want to get stuck without access to my materials if the internet goes down. Not being online also obviously cuts down on distractions. This is also going to be relevant for the first thing I'll talk about, equipment. I'm not comfortable walking around Bogota or Medellin with a more high-end camera, but if you're doing research in the US or Europe, you will have more options. I always bring a couple of key pieces of equipment with me to the archive. I've always used a separate digital camera rather than my phone because I started my dissertation research before smartphones were sufficiently powerful, and because I'd run into storage problems now given the volume of photos that I tend to take. I'm pretty agnostic about what kind of camera to recommend. I would, however, suggest that you look into a model that is compatible with a remote shutter trigger. This would allow you to avoid bending over the table, bending over your tripod a lot, and thus avoiding the repetitive stresses that come with spending hour after hour and day after day in the archive. If you haven't spent a lot of sustained time in an archive, I think you'd be surprised by the strain it can put on your neck and on your back. I bought a small digital SLR camera in 2012, but the only remote trigger I could find for it never really worked, and I wish now that I had done more homework to find a better system. My next recommendation is that you purchase a camera arm like this one. You'll also have to buy the clamp that affixes it to the table or chair. Overall, the setup will run you about $80–85. The main advantage of this arm as compared to a normal tripod is that it allows you to avoid photographing documents at a slant, at an angle. It's just generally easier to configure the camera arm for different shooting conditions. It also happens to be a great conversation starter in the archive, at least in Colombia. One situation, though, where I wouldn't recommend using a camera arm or a tripod is in photographing newspapers. And for that, I turn up the resolution and just hold the camera in my hand, because it's much easier to shift the camera around freehand than to manipulate the newspaper relative to a camera that's fixed on the arm. And rather than try to capture an article in just a couple of shots, I'll also take a lot of overlapping photos of a newspaper page just to make sure that I don't miss any text. My other equipment recommendation is a memory card reader. If you have a Mac laptop, you have a slot for this on the side already built in. And it will give you transfer speeds that are faster than those you'd get connecting to your computer via your computer's cable. And if you don't have one built into your laptop, it'll only run you about $10 to get one, and it's definitely a good purchase. You can get memory cards that will wirelessly upload to your computer as you shoot. And this is another option I haven't pursued because I've done most of my archival work internationally without either my cell data plan or reliable access to the internet. Alright, let's move to the archive. If you're able before your trip to get your hands on the index of the collection you'll be using, take the time to select materials you want to look at and put that information into a usable form. And I would particularly recommend Excel. So this is my take on an index from a central Colombian judicial archive that I used a few years ago. And essentially, I just put down all the relevant information. So the shelf and box number that I would need to order each of these files, and then details, location data, the date of the crime committed for these trials, and so on and so forth. Now, I'll do a variant of this too if I'm arriving in an archive without a detailed notion of what the collection looks like. After skimming the index, putting in my first pull order, I'll photograph the index, and that night back at the hotel I'll put together a similar spreadsheet, which will be my agenda for digitization. This brings us to the heart of my best practices for archives. First, after I quickly skim through a folder or box to make sure it's worthwhile, I will photograph just about everything there. This ultimately, it will take more time than it would to go through and photograph the most relevant stuff, but we generally don't have that kind of time in an archive. And crucially, you also don't know what's important. It's better to grab what you can and then make sense of it later. Second, and this is a point I covered in the first video, write everything down. If you come across an interesting document as you make your first pass through a collection before you start photographing, jot down a note to yourself. However significant it may seem to you in the moment, it will prove surprisingly easy to lose track of. Third, as you start photographing, keep track of what you've gone through. And I color code my progress in this regard. This is a practice I also mentioned in the first video that we'll come back to again later here as well. So here in column O, yellow means that I photographed a judicial case or folder or box. Orange would mean that I looked at it, but it wasn't of any use. And with smaller collections, I also jot down the date that I photographed a folder or box. And this sheet isn't a representative example, but I use an 8-digit code, year, month, day. And putting down a date also provides a redundancy. Let's say that I lost track of an interesting document, but remember telling a friend about it at lunch that day. I can then go back to this sheet and say, okay, if I digitize that document on this day, I know it's in one of these 3 folders, and this redundancy will make it easier to locate the document. Now, fourth recommendation, this one is really crucial, is to always make sure that you photograph the box and folder you're looking at. And this is another redundancy which will help you to organize your photographs at the end of your research day. Related to this, when I reach the end of photographing a folder, I take a picture of a colored piece of paper in my hand, which will make it easier to differentiate the end of one folder and the start of another in the thumbnails, thumbnails when it comes time to organize the photos. And when I come to the end of a box, I take 2 pictures of my hand instead. All right, so now we've built an index, photographed some documents, and kept track of what all we've looked at. Our task now is to keep everything organized. Here, I would not recommend that you use photos when you go to move your photos off of your camera or your phone. It's not clear where the image files are actually located on your hard drive if you're using this program. I would instead use image capture, which is just in the applications folder. It comes built into the Mac OS, and it's a simple little program that gives you a lot more control over where your files end up. So if we were to plug in a camera or a phone here, it would allow us to select or create a new folder where the files will be sent. So I have within my documents folder here just a folder marked new where I've put some sample photographs. These are actually photographs from 2007 that I never got around to organizing. So at the end of each day in the archives, and I wouldn't put this off because the photos pile up, I take the pictures that are in this folder and I move the photos into folders that recreate the structure of the archive. And you can see here, by the way, the red piece of paper that I've photographed to mark the end of one folder. Let's take one of the most important archival collections I've worked with, the Interior Ministry papers at the Colombian National Archives, or AGN. And this collection consists of 4 main subcategories, the most important of which is Despacho Ministro, or ministerial correspondence. You can see here how I've recreated the hierarchy of the archive with the boxes in their constituent folders. You'll also note how I color-coded the folders that I finished going through according to my general system. The next step I took with the Interior Ministry papers was to create a detailed document-by-document index, which I did before I photographed the records. And this isn't a practice I've done across my research. At the U.S. National Archives, for instance, the materials are organized in a relatively more chronological fashion. I therefore created a partial index after I took notes on the documents, which is something I've also done with smaller archival collections. And we'll come back to this in a bit. So let's build an index for one folder. A folder that's really important in my research. So go ahead with a new spreadsheet here, and first of all, create a dummy column down the left side. Just number 1 through however big the index is going to be. This is a trick I also employ in other databases when I'm transcribing from documents. Excel can be dumb, and if we were to reorder the documents later on, we could simply sort by column A, and this would get us back to our original order without us having to do a lot more work. So we have our dummy column on the left, and then we could put in archive, box, folder, the folio or page number, and then we're going to do 3 keywords, as well as the date of the document. So, hypothetically, let's say this was about what the Colombians, well, let's actually go through. So this is AGN, create another column for the collection. We'll Interior Ministry, Despacho Ministro, folder 7, box 7, folder 51. And then we'll go ahead and just create a couple of sample document tags here. So what the Colombians call public order, here we could call it just general governance. And I'm going to leave just the date blank. And what I'm not doing here is transcribing the full citation information for each document, who a telegram or memo is from, who it's to, the full date, etc. You could do that, but it would be wasted time because you might only end up citing documents 1, 2, and 5 if you can imagine the spreadsheet more filled out. So then there are a couple of ways to take and make use of this keyword database. And the first is to sort by keyword and date. So select everything, go up to sort, and then sort by keyword 1, keyword 2, and so on. And it's important here to always put the location of the document in the last of these 3 columns. Even if there's only one other keyword, it's important to keep it in that last column just to keep things consistent across the spreadsheet. Now, if you sort by keywords and make that your research approach, this risks missing how documents fit together, because the way you tag these documents, the keywords you use are going to evolve over time, or you might have misread a document the first time through. There's something to be said then for just reading a document through from start to finish. This is what I call the difference between a vertical and a horizontal approach. A vertical approach is you go in, you pick some keywords, you pick some key themes, some key actors, and read up on them. So you have sort of vertical of information, of notes. The horizontal method is the brute force method of just going in and reading from start to finish. Now, where those two coincide, where you're able to build up a more general context but also have the more detailed information about a particular theme or character, that's where you get enough material to start writing an article or start writing a chapter. Here's my comprehensive index, what I call the doc base. You'll note at the bottom that each different archive I've used has its own tab, and the AGNs tab is the most extensive. So again, you've got our dummy column, the archive information, collection, subcollection. Here I've grouped together the folder and box number, which I wouldn't do again. You'll also note that over here I've added a couple of columns, and this was a practice I only developed later. I wish I'd known to do it from the beginning. Just a couple columns for notes, which I'll use if I'm going through a folder and don't want to pause to take extensive notes in another program. And column L also shows the date that I read a document, and you'll note the use of the color coding scheme as well. There's one final thing in the doc base I want to cover in this part of the video before moving on to note taking. I don't see a lot of point in renaming every batch of image files, so long as you've organized them thoroughly in the Finder, first of all, and then index them well in Excel. That's why I have a column here called IMG, which I sometimes use just to jot down the original file number that my camera assigned to the picture, just as a way to index where a particular document might be in a given folder. This is particularly helpful when you have a folder where the pages aren't individually numbered as they are at the AGN. That said, you may want to rename your image files. I've done this with some smaller archival collections like the personal correspondence of former Colombian presidents. And for this, I use Automator, which is also built into the Mac OS and is also in the applications folder. Automator lets you select from a set of pre-programmed actions to construct a workflow. So go ahead and select workflow here. And this is going to be great for batch renaming of files or other automated tasks. So go up to Get Specified Finder Items, just drag that over here to the right, and then rename Finder Items over here. And I'll go ahead and make sequential. We'll give it a new name. We'll call it AGN, again, following our abbreviation here. So we'll go back to this folder, just create a copy just in case. Take all these JPEGs, drop them in here. Start numbers at start them at 0 and make them all 3 digits long. And then it's as easy as hitting run. It takes under a second. And then if we go in, we've renamed all of these image files. And this could make it a little bit easier to hunt down a specific document later on. Let's turn then to taking notes and keeping track of citations for our archival materials. And 2 comments to start off here. As I mentioned before, keep a research diary. Second, the note-taking practices I follow are the same as for secondary sources. However, for the citations of secondary sources, I use Zotero, which I went over in the first video. For archival sources, I'm going to build off the spreadsheets we've already explored here. And for notes, I use DEVONthink Personal. There are other options you might consider, particularly if you use handwritten or more visually rich sources. In particular, I'm thinking here of Tropy, which is made by the same people behind Zotero. And one of the nice things about this, I'll go ahead and play some of their promotional video, is that it allows you to tag an individual part of a document and then take separate notes on just that selection. Another option that's come out recently is Digital Mappa, which if you're using a visually rich file like a manuscript or a map, might be helpful for tagging and taking notes on that particular piece of a particular piece of a document, as you can see here. It also allows you to link across different kinds of documents. And I haven't used either of these, but might try them out if I were starting my doctoral research. Now, one nice thing about DEVONthink is that it allows you to organize your files hierarchically. So creating folders and then putting rich text files in them, or other PDFs you could drop and drag in here as well. It's some of the same functions as Evernote or other programs, but along with some other more powerful tools that I've never used. And I find that it's vastly superior to Word. If you're taking notes in Word, stop. So as I mentioned, you can create folders and then rich text files. So I have a folder here for archives. I have another one for notes down here where I put my secondary source notes. One of the great things about DEVONthink is its search feature. So if we put in the folder we've been looking at, DM751, you can see a ranked list of search results for that term. So these are all the different note files in which I have notes from that folder. Now let's practice taking notes for just a moment. So the way I take notes, clear out the search here. The way I take notes is note 1, and you could see, you could picture yourself doing document 1, and then our information. Quote 1, building off of document 1. You see here, it can be annoying to go up and copy and paste for every line of documents, every line of notes that you take. And it's important to always keep each line of notes linked to the metadata of where it came from, because it can be very hard to go back, very annoying to go back and locate this information later on. So one trick I would recommend, because it can be annoying to copy and paste this, is just to put down a nonsense string of characters. So here I use ZZ. You might use something longer because ZZ is a letter combination you might actually come across. So then when I'm done with my notes, at the end of this document, I can do a find and replace and simply replace ZZ with the author's name, the name of the document, whatever it might be. And this really is a nice way to save a little bit of time. My writing process consists of going through all of my different note files and then copying and pasting notes into files for each section of the article or chapter that I'm working on. Now you could do this in DEVONthink, but it's a little bit frustrating because DEVONthink will organize your RTF files alphabetically. So if you want to reorganize your notes, say, okay, I need to start off the article with this section and then move to this section, you have to number them 0, 1, 2, and then you have to change the numbers every time you want to reorganize your thoughts. I have recently started using Scrivener for writing. The interface is a lot more like DEVONthink, but it allows for easier reorganization of files and has some other nice features as well. So here you could see, rather than having to manually renumber component pieces of a chapter, I can just drag them and drop them. And as I said, it's got some other nice features as well. Now, once I've taken all these notes, I've built an outline, I've written the paper, it's only then that I go back into DocBase and fill out the citation data for all of the archival sources that I've ended up using. This is what I call backloading rather than front-loading that part of the work, because again, I may not end up using all the documents that I've tagged in the index. Now, you'll note a couple of examples in the DocBase where I have put in citation information for documents I ended up citing. So there's a chapter here, or column here rather, for chapter, which indicates the paper or the article, the chapter that I've cited the document in. So FP7 here is chapter 7 of my book, Forgotten Peace. And I didn't always use DocBase for this purpose until a grad student asked why I didn't keep citation data alongside the entries for each document. Now, I still do have a separate Excel file called footnotes, which replicates a lot of the structure of the DocBase. This is a legacy of my earlier research process. You can also see how many tabs I have in these two files. It's also just a way for me to keep things a little less complicated. So this index here is shows photographs from the archive of a post-war radio news program in Medellin. And the nature of this unique source made it important for me to link each image to detailed metadata in these columns over here in order to make sure that I knew the date and broadcast time of each line of notes. So you can see here it's a much more comprehensive index than what I ended up citing, but it's all there, which was really helpful for me as I was creating the narrative to say, okay, I don't, if I look just at my notes and I see ahm.clarin.213 image file 15, I have no idea what day that is. So this was very basic work that ended up saving me a lot of time later on. Now, one other thing to point out here, which I also use in DocBase, is this column called multiples, which tells me that I've cited this document multiple times within the same chapter. And that means when I've gone through and put in all the citation information and go back into Word, just copy and paste this, but if I've cited a document multiple times, I don't have to put in the full citation data. I can just do this much of it here. One final tip to close out this video. I'm not a big believer in running all my digitized archival sources through optical character recognition, OCR, in order to make the text searchable. If you're trying to do a lot of documents, it just takes a lot of time to run the OCR, let alone go in and read it. You also don't necessarily know what it is you should be searching for within your texts. OCR documents, in other words, are not a good starting place. But here's a scenario where I have used OCR. Let's say that in the process of going through my notes, I need to find the remainder of a quote, but it turns out that my notes are slightly off. I know the document, but not the page number. OCR is perfect here. So let's go back to this folder from Despacho Ministro. This is a real example of using OCR that I did when I was translating Forgotten Peace into Spanish. So there's a little booklet here, 20, 30 some pages. All right, so we know it's image 5 through image 24. So go ahead and select those. And the full version of Adobe Acrobat has a very workable, usable OCR. And if you don't have Acrobat, you can try your university's computer lab. The one time I did run a lot of documents through OCR, I set up shop in my department's computer room on a Friday and was running OCR on 3 different machines at once to try to speed up the process. Now, one lesson of that experience is that Adobe has trouble processing more than 250 or 300 pages at a time. So if you have a really thick file that you want to OCR, break it into multiple parts. All right, so let's try this. I'm going to go over to Tools, Create PDF, Combine Files. Go ahead and drop those in there. Let it run for a second just to create the PDF. Great. Now, there are 2 ways to run OCR. And the first would be to hit Command F to run to find, which will generally bring up a dialog window asking you if you want to make the text searchable since it's not already searchable. Now, I accidentally turned this off on my laptop, so we'll go with a second option. Just go back up to Tools, Enhance Scans, and then Recognize Text. All right, Recognize text, I've selected Spanish, a lot of different languages. I found if you're doing Spanish and English, it doesn't make a big distinction. All right, and then I'm going to hit recognize text, and it's going to go through, and it'll take a little bit of time, but it'll turn it into a searchable text that I can then go in, find the keyword, find the rest of the quote that I'm looking for. This has definitely saved me time with longer congressional reports, for instance, that you might download from Hathitrust or the National Security Archive or what have you. Now, one other thing with OCR, you're going to need a pretty decent photograph that's not at an angle and so on in order for the software to work. But that said, these images here, which again I've run OCR on in my research process, my writing process. These digital photos I took at medium resolution on a 3-point-something megapixel camera back in 2006, and they work fine for OCR purposes. I hope that these videos have been useful. And please let me know on Twitter how these practices work out for you. I'm at RA Carl. You can also read more about my research at racarl.com. Happy archiving.